Good afternoon, bonjour. If members want to take their seats, we'll start in 1 minute. On va commencer dans 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. Welcome to the Audit Committee meeting for Thursday, July 4th. Bienvenue au comité de vérification pour le 4 juillet. All members are here. So, let's get to the agenda. Any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Confirmation of minutes. There's 2. The public meeting of May 29th. Are those carried? Thank you. And the confidential minutes that you will have received on the pink sheets, are they carried? Thank you very much. Merci. And so, yes, please. Please return the pink sheets to the coordinator if you're done with them. Thank you, Councillor Hubley. We have 4 items on today's agenda, 4 articles à l'agenda d'aujourd'hui. All of them have presentations, and so there's no consent agenda. And thus, we will start with item number 1. And if I could start with asking Vice Chair Meehan to introduce a motion.
Thank you, Chair. Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General, Investigation of OC Transpo Clothing Allowance was not circulated with the agenda package. Therefore, it be resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89(3) of the Procedure Bylaw, being Bylaw number 2019-8.
Is that carried? Carried. Thank you. Mr. Auditor General, your presentation, please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président et les membres du comité. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Aujourd'hui, nous avons 3 rapports pour présenter, puisqu'ils découlent des signalements sur la ligne directe de fraude et d'abus. Une enquête sur l'allocation d'habillement d'OC Transpo, un examen du programme d'aide et d'hébergement d'urgence, une enquête sur un incident de vol du fonds, et finalement, le rapport annuel 2018 sur la ligne directe de fraude et d'abus. Today, Mr. Chair, we have 3 reports. And these 3 reports we will be presenting, they stem from calls to the Fraud and Waste Hotline, the investigation of OC Transpo clothing allowance, review of emergency shelter program, the use of a specific hotel, investigation of a cash theft incident, and finally, the annual report on the 2018 Fraud and Waste Hotline. This does not work if you got there. Just a second, Mr. Chair. I'm going to make sure that...
Just so members of the committee know, the presentation will go through the first item, which is investigation of OC Transpo clothing allowance in the presentation. Then we'll stop, ask your questions, and then we'll go on. We'll accept or we'll receive the report and then go on to the second item.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur le Président. L'allocation ou l'habillement est un avantage négocié dans la convention collective conclue avec les 3 syndicats de la Ville. Les relations avec chacun des syndicats sont régies par une convention collective distincte. On entend par carte payée les cartes prépayées de Marks, aussi appelées cartes Cadieux, qui sont provisionnées selon des soldes préétablis et qui ont été distribuées parmi certains employés d'OC Transport. M. Ed Miner, vérificateur général adjoint, présentera cet rapport. Mr. Ed Miner, Deputy Auditor General, will present this report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This report is the investigation of the OC Transpo clothing allowance, and these concerns were raised through a fraud and waste hotline report. And the concerns related to three parts. First was that there was a clothing allowance that was being distributed, and it should have been a taxable benefit. That the eligibility of employees receiving the clothing allowance was in question, as well as questions over controls over the distribution of the prepaid cards. Now, as a bit of background on this, the clothing allowance is a negotiated benefit under agreements with 3 unions. And as you know, relations with each union are governed by separate collective agreements. And so when the fraud and waste hotline report came in, the practice at OC Transpo was to provide this clothing allowance via prepaid cards. And by prepaid cards, we're referring to Mark's prepaid cards, also known as sometimes gift cards, but they're cards with a predetermined balance that can be used to purchase items at the Mark's stores. And they were intended to be redeemed towards the purchase of work-related clothing and or safety shoes or boots. And although they're in the agreements, they're referred to as purchasing cards, just want to make it clear we're not talking about the city's purchasing cards, which are actually credit cards that the staff use. These were, again, these were purchasing cards that were from Mark's that were meant to go there. So our objectives, again, were to determine if the prepaid card clothing allowance should have been considered a taxable benefit, to assess whether the employees receiving the clothing allowance were in fact eligible, and to assess controls over purchasing, distributing, and safeguarding the prepaid cards. The allegations raised in the fraud and waste report came in March of 2018, and at that time, as I mentioned, OC Transpo was distributing the prepaid cards to employees to redeem their clothing allowance. Since that time, in October of 2018, OC Transpo discontinued the use of the prepaid cards, and so now they actually are paid by cash through payroll as part of their pay. And therefore, our scope was expanded to 2019 so we could test the new process for employees to make sure that those employees who received the clothing allowance in 2019 were indeed eligible. Our first finding was that we found that the clothing allowance was not being treated as a taxable benefit before 2018. Before 2018, the clothing allowances that were included in the collective agreements were not treated as a taxable benefit, and this meant that they were not included on the employee's T4. We reviewed the tax implications in 2018, and we concluded that some of the amounts that were distributed very likely should have been treated as a taxable benefit. Management concluded the same thing in its own review, and therefore they changed their practice after that. So in 2018, payroll allocated the taxable portion of those prepaid cards that had been given out earlier in the year to the employees that received them, and so that it showed up on their T4 that year. And going forward, a portion of the clothing allowance will be treated as a taxable benefit for the employees who receive it. Then we looked at the employees who received it, and we found no evidence that ineligible employees received the clothing allowance in 2019. The allegations were that came in our report were that a significant number of ineligible employees who had received the prepaid cards. When we looked at the criteria for which employees are eligible for the annual clothing allowance, we go back to their respective collective agreements. And we did note that the positions listed in one of the agreements, this is the ATU 1760 agreement, and they identify the clothing allowance, the positions that are eligible for clothing allowance, but they're not identical to the current titles of the positions. Therefore, OC Transpo Management uses their judgment to try and identify which current positions correspond to those positions that are set out in the collective agreement. And although we found that the positions that they give the allowance to could reasonably link back to the collective agreement, there's still some judgment involved, and as such, there could be allegations of favoritism or inconsistent treatment of employees. We tested the eligibility of a sample of the employees who received the allowance in 2019, and other than the potential source of confusion about some of those ATU 1760 positions, we found no ineligible employees. And lastly, we found that the controls related to the distribution of the prepaid cards were really no longer relevant. At the time, I said they had been distributing the prepaid cards, and that has since switched. So because it was discontinued, we determined that that portion of the report was no longer eligible, or no longer applicable, sorry. We made one recommendation, and management has agreed to implement it.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Miner,
did you wish to stop for questions on this
if we
report?
could, Mr. Auditor General. Mr. Miner, thank you very much. Councillor Kavanagh, then Vice Chair Meehan, and then.
I can wait till, is this the end of this presentation?
This is the end of this presentation, and let's, of this section, so on this matter, let's do our questions, please.
Okay, all right. No, I just want to thank you very much for the report. It's good to know that this is being watched. It seems like it's, not a huge thing, but it's still important to make sure that dollars are spent well. My question is, in regards to other departments, I mean, OC Transpo employees are treated separately, but are there similar arrangements with the city in terms of same needs, in terms of clothing allowance? Is it treated the same?
Mr. Chair, through you, there are some similar arrangements with other unions, similar benefits, and there are different practices in different places. The intent from our recommendations and from the work that we've done is that the principles that we've identified would be applicable elsewhere and would be picked up by management.
I just wanted to check to see if it's consistent with other policies we have. Thank you.
Councillor Meehan, please.
The reason that you audited this was because there was a complaint that people were concerned that people who were ineligible were getting the cards. You've concluded that no one ineligible received the gift cards. Is that true? And how can you determine if that is in fact the case?
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, you're right. The allegation was that the control over the cards wasn't adequate, that there were individuals who weren't eligible who were receiving the cards, and that there was favoritism being shown by the individuals who were distributing the cards. When we went in, the distribution of the gift cards had already taken place, and management had indicated that they were going to change the approach that they would use in the future. So the first thing that they did is they indicated that they would change their process and ensure that the taxable benefit was applied in 2018, and that happened. And as Mr. Miner pointed out, because of the allegations that were made about ineligible individuals receiving the cards, we extended our scope to 2019 and tested the 2019 process, the new one that was introduced. And other than the confusion around some of the job titles, we found no indication that ineligible individuals received gift cards, received this payment in 2019. But because of the controls or lack thereof of the previous process, it wasn't possible for us to audit it and say one way or the other whether ineligible employees received gift cards.
Is there any way Is there any requirement at all for the employee who receives a gift card to verify that the money was spent actually on clothing for work?
Mr. Chair, our understanding is that this is a negotiated benefit within the contract, and it's a fixed amount. And there's
So-
no requirement for the individual to prove that they spent more or less than that amount on boots and work apparel or safety apparel.
So he or she could receive the gift card, but if it was spent on their family, that's perfectly allowable.
I would have to agree that that's possible. It's a fixed amount that is negotiated in the collective agreement.
And-
Negotiated and stated in the collective agreement.
I don't want to belabor it, but how much, I'm assuming this is for boots and a uniform, and is $450, does that cover it, or is that more than cover it? You know, I know how much a pair of work boots cost, like $150 for a good pair.
Mr. Chair, I would have to defer to the management, and I would also have to point out that in some instances, the work activity of some staff, their work is harder on their material, on their boots and their uniforms than it would be in other activities. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Okay.
Councillor El-Shantiri, did you? No. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on Councillor Meehan's point, before we accidentally create an impression that OC Transport employees maybe are abusing this system, is it not part of the collective agreement that the clothing allowance is good for, I think, 2 years? If their shirts get ruined, for example, and have to buy more, they do that at their own expense. Is that not correct? They're not issued extra cards. If their uniform gets ruined or whatever, it's on them after this. Is that not correct? Or is that better off going to staff if you don't know the
You
answer?
can double check with Mr. Manconi. I'm not sure if, but my understanding is certainly that yeah, they have certain responsibility for work clothing, and I say if the clothing gets torn, it's up to them to replace it. Part of the benefit is for work clothing. Part of it is for safety equipment, like boots.
And is it not a requirement of their job that they have steel-toed boots, for example, in some jobs, and wear their uniform? So it's not a matter of getting a gift card and then giving it to their family, as some may think. Correct?
That's certainly my understanding, yes.
They have to pay for it. Okay. And from a taxpayer perspective, would it not be more expensive if, like, some operations have a shop within the garage or whatever that keep all the uniforms in various sizes, and you go there and you get your shirt? Would that not be a whole lot more expensive for the OC Transport operation than to go this way?
Mr. Chair, good question on the part of the councillor. It's my understanding that there were, in the past, there were stores, and that this was chosen as a less expensive alternative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Auditor General.
Thank you. Follow-up, Councillor Meehan?
I didn't want to leave the impression that I was suggesting that there was any untoward spending or anything that the employees are up to. It's just pointing out some of the loopholes or some of the gaps in validation. That's all.
Thank you. Councillor El-Shantiri.
To the Deputy Auditor, with this issue, you close the loop on it, basically. Now we're done. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
Because there's been change of
yeah.
practice and all this.
Yeah, change the
Okay.
practice, but our only recommendation was
Yes.
to clarify the wording, if they can, in the collective agreement, so the positions, are just on clarification, and that's, otherwise, yes, this closes the loop on this issue, in our mind.
Reading, if we go through the report and reading your comments, so this issue been dealt with and been move on from it because there's some new process in place so that doesn't happen again. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. I have a couple of questions. Just a precision. Mr. Manconi, maybe you're the one to answer this. Are these items for logoed, OC Transpo logoed items, or are they work clothes that need to withstand working in the garage? Or?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. They're mandatory safety clothing that you need to wear to show up to work, and to be blunt, if you don't have the equipment, you're not getting paid that day. You get sent home. So there are no loopholes, there are no gaps. The Auditor General didn't find any gaps. We've got the validation list with payroll, and for this particular work unit, gone are the days where we have an expensive internal operation where you're managing stores operations and handing out work boots and so forth. So if you want to come in to work and get paid, you have to show up with your safety apparel, and this gets you that, and the cost of work boots are escalating, particularly insulated ones and so forth. So I know it sounds like a lot, but they have to be fully equipped.
So just to be clear, this is not the OC Transpo uniforms that drivers are wearing that are logoed?
No, that is the operation that Chair Hubley was talking about, where they have the shirts and so forth. That comes out of that operation was privatized years ago to drive the costs down and to put rigor into that process too by a third party.
Thank you. Mr. Auditor General, while the program was discontinued and no ineligible employees received the cards, can you not comment on the control within OC Transpo as to how those cards were distributed? Did the amounts concur, the number of cards distributed concur with the number of employees on the payroll for that particular unit? Or Mr. Meyer, I apologize.
Chair, we did do some preliminary work in that area, but again, when the process was changing, we stopped that work. So we didn't really come to a complete conclusion. We talked to some people, we got some sheets and had signatures on them, but we didn't try to do a detailed reconciliation of the cards that have been received and the value of them and the amount purchased. We didn't complete that work.
Okay, thank you. Now that the amount is just given to the employee on their payroll and they can get the appropriate safety equipment anywhere, just as a matter of governance, since we were de facto sending people to Marks to buy that safety equipment, did we buy those gift cards at the nominal face value, or did we get any sort of a discount given that we were sending Marks a good amount of business? And my follow-up question will be, how were they chosen and why was Marks chosen?
I don't know, predates me, but I can certainly find out and follow up with you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now the necessity of the nerdy accountant question. How is it that payroll in a corporation like the City of Ottawa did not realize that non-logoed clothing is a taxable benefit, and that we waited till 2018 to figure that out?
I'm just looking to see if anybody from finance is here. I will say this, from my many years at this stuff, the tax rules change regularly, and there are interpretations that you have to make. I know if Marion Similak was here, she'd be able to answer that question very quickly. So I don't think there were gaps. I think there were changes in the environment, and we've addressed them, as the Auditor General has said.
Yeah, and I do understand. I think those rules have been in place for a long time, and I'm just following up with, I don't know if it's Councillor Kavanagh or Councillor Meehan, in other city departments, if there's a clothing allowance, are they being treated appropriately within the payroll system and within the on employees' T4s?
Mr. Chair, the most obvious ones is clothing allowance would be our emergency services, and they have arrangements also that are built in their collective agreements, as the Auditor General said, in terms of how they receive their clothing. Some are on points, some are by value. Then there's all kinds of rules, and I don't have the familiarity off the top of my head, quite frankly, because I've been removed from a while. But it's something. Unfortunately, someone isn't here from finance, but it's something we'll check to make sure that, as the Auditor General said, that the general principle of taxable benefit is applied to all clothing allowances or variations of.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Seeing no more questions, is the Audit Committee receiving the investigation of the clothing allowance and recommend that Council consider and approve the report recommendations? Is that carried? Thank you. On to item number 2. I will ask Vice Chair Meehan to introduce her motion.
Thank you, Chair. Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General, Review of Emergency Shelter Program, Use of a Specific Hotel was not circulated with the agenda package, therefore it be resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89(3) of the Procedure Bylaw, being Bylaw number 2019-8.
Thank you very much. Merci. I will ask the Auditor General to continue with the presentation, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Notre deuxième rapport, c'est un examen du programme d'aide et d'hébergement d'urgence. Nous avons mené cet examen pour donner suite aux motifs de préoccupation adressés au vérificateur général. Ces motifs de préoccupation se rapportaient expressivement à ces propriétés résidentielles offertes par une fourniture de refuge d'urgence.
We conducted this review in response to concerns were raised with the Auditor General, and the concerns were specific to properties that were provided by a particular provider of emergency shelter accommodation. The objectives of our review were to assess the concerns that were raised and assess compliance with legislation, bylaws, policies, and procedures. The scope of our review was the use of those certain properties for temporary emergency shelter accommodations. However, in order for us to investigate and understand the use of these properties, we had to obtain a broader understanding of the use of hotels and motels in the emergency shelter program. To provide some background on these areas, hotels and motels are used primarily for families as opposed to for single individuals. The city has only one shelter for families, and it's located on Carling Avenue. I'm not sure if the councillors will recall that there used to be another one, but the Forward Family Shelter closed its doors in February of 2019. So in 2018, on the average night, there were 219 families in hotels and motels and post-secondary institutions. We called these the off-site placements. And this was up from 181 families the previous year and up from 92 families in 2016. So you see it's more than doubled in the 2 years. And by way of comparison, there's only space for 22 families in the city's family shelter on Carling Avenue. The amounts paid to all the hotels and motels for emergency shelters, temporary emergency shelter, was $9.3 million in 2018. This is up from $7.2 million in 2017 and more than double the $4.3 million that was paid in 2016. The amount that was paid to this specific hotel provider was $3.8 million in 2018. And this was up from $2.5 million in 2017 and $1.5 million in 2016. Therefore, in 2018, payments to this one provider made up 41% of the total amount paid. This provider I should point out, is the only one that the city uses that also offers apartment-style accommodations in addition to its motel. So families, I should point out, often prefer to stay in these apartments as they have kitchens included. And this can be especially important as these are generally fairly long stays that the families are in these hotels. In 2018, the average family in these emergency shelter hotel motels was there for 4 months. So this is it's not a quick situation. Our first finding in this area was that in light of the increasing cost, we looked at the city's plan and strategies to address the situation. We found that the city does have a medium to long-term strategy, and it's implemented a number of measures to reduce the demand for and increase the supply of emergency shelter spaces. These measures include negotiations with a community partner to expand capacity for families. However, further strategic efforts are needed as the use of motels and hotels continued to grow in 2018, and this is a very expensive option compared to other alternatives. We also found the process for adding new hotels to the city's list of hotel providers was not based on a competitive process. I should point out that a competitive process is not required under the delegation of authority bylaw. The way it worked is that Housing Services put together a hotel working group to do outreach to local hotels and motels, and then interested hotels and motels that met the city's requirements, which did include a rate range, were added to the city's list of providers, and then a new letter of agreement was executed with them. Should also point out that some hotels and motels will provide temporary accommodation services to the city, but they choose not to sign a letter of agreement with the city due to some of the clauses that are required in that agreement. The OAG reached out to 3 other municipalities to get an idea of what their processes were like. We found that 2 of the municipalities had used an RFP process, one of which was to procure hotels for services such as this, and the other was to procure a third-party service provider who in turn would oversee placement processes, which included procuring hotels. So one of which was directly applicable, one of which was somewhat applicable, and the other did not use an RFP process. We found that we observed no bias towards the selected hotel provider in the hotel placement process. So each household or family requiring placement is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and they're placed depending on their specific needs and then hotel availability. So when space was available, the city-owned or community shelters were given properly given priority over hotels when placing households. However, we note that, again, there were only 22 spaces in the Carling shelter, so that was usually full, but when it wasn't, it was filled up right away. We found the rates charged by the specific hotel provider for hotel rooms were competitive when compared with the city's agreed rates with similar hotels. But again, the specific hotel provider is the only one that also offers residential properties, as in apartments. And the specific hotel provider, should point out, charges the same rates for apartments as they do for their hotel rooms. Whether or not it's cost effective, we looked at the cost of an apartment through this process versus a monthly rent, because basically if a family is in these apartments for a month, it's just over $3,000 for that month, which is more than a market rate for an apartment would be. However, the market rate is only available if you commit to a lease, and so that puts us into a different situation. We found city staff were monitoring households on a regular basis to ensure that they were staying at the accommodations to which they had been assigned by the city. But there were some exceptions. The specific hotel provider undertook some renovations to their properties that were listed in the agreement, and they had city people, or sorry, people that city had placed were in those apartments. And in some cases, they notified the city in advance, and so the city approved them moving to another location. However, there were also cases when the provider renovated the apartments and moved the people out without notifying the city that they were doing so, and they moved them to non-approved properties that they also owned. However, when city staff did become aware of the situation, they intervened and the families were moved back into approved properties. When we were looking at this area, we also found that the specific hotel provider undertook some renovations or modifications without a building permit when they were doing their work. We were glad to see that there's a solid invoice verification process in place. The process checked the amounts paid to the specific hotel provider, making sure that they were for authorized individuals and for authorized durations. Hotel invoices that come in are processed each month and are paid via a purchasing card. We found that the city's purchasing card procedures were not being followed by city staff. The purchasing card was assigned to one employee while another employee was authorizing the spending. We found that purchasing card charges were regularly split to stay under the card's $100,000 limit. And we also found that the financial services unit was not reviewing the purchasing card reconciliations that were prepared by housing services, which is one of the things they're supposed to be doing. We found the city's agreement with the specific hotel provider. It identified 8 residential properties in addition to the hotel, and we did observe that one of the properties on the hotel had undergone work without the required building permit. So as we mentioned earlier, we found that 2 of the properties listed on the agreement appear to have had additions or modifications that did not comply with building code and/or zoning laws, and that building code services staff indicated they would need to inspect the properties to assess compliance. And lastly, we looked at the property taxes for the non-hotel properties, and we noted they were calculated based on a residential use, and the current arrangement with the city for those properties suggests a possible commercial use. So we made 9 recommendations in our report, and management has agreed with all of them.
Monsieur le Président nous avait fait 9 recommandations et la gestion est d'accord avec toutes. Nous pouvons prendre pause pour des questions maintenant.
Merci, Monsieur le Vérificateur Général, and thank you, Mr. Minor. Just before we continue, Vice Chair Meehan introduced a motion at the beginning of this segment. Was that motion carried to introduce the report? You had done the motion. Is the motion carried? Carried. Thank you. Questions on this segment? Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions to the audit, and thank you for getting back to us quickly with this one, too. I'm surprised with the use of the competitive bidding process that something like that wasn't already in place. Because if there had been a procedure like that, this example wouldn't have happened, correct? We wouldn't be paying $3,000 for a room.
Mr. Chair, we do know that a competitive bidding process wasn't used. I don't think we can presuppose the results, but certainly practice has proven in many activities at the city and in other organizations that a competitive process usually delivers better prices.
So I didn't see it in here, and maybe staff will have to answer this. I see that they will put a competitive process in place for Q3, but is the expectation that all current contracts will have to follow through this process? Like, we're not going to grandfather this person, for example, at the higher rates?
Welcome, Ms. Van Busker.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. We will be launching a competitive RFP process this month, and nobody will be grandfathered. Everybody that we currently have letters of agreement with will be expected to apply to the RFP.
Will part of that process, while we have you here, will part of that process be, as pointed out in the audit here, it doesn't look like there was building permits issued for the work done on that case. You know, if somebody's getting money from the city to provide a service, I would hope that they're following all the rules at the city. So will that be included?
Mr. Chair, yes, we agree with the recommendation that was in the audit, and we'll be working closely with Building Code Services when we sign new agreements to make sure that all the properties or hotels and motels comply with applicable building code regulations, fire safety, etc.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. Councillor Kavanagh, please.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate this study was done so quickly, and I appreciate the responses from staff on it to agree with it. I'm glad to, Councillor Hubie asked a question about the competitive process, because it was mentioned that the other municipalities have done that. My concern was, and on that case, was it possible, because we're in such a tight market, what stresses that puts on us in terms of the fact that the vacancy rates are so low across the city that competition is a tough word, because it's kind of whatever's available. And has that been part of the problem?
Mr. Chair, so certainly the rising rents and low vacancy rate has contributed to some of the issues we're seeing around family homelessness in general in our city, and our ability to move families out of temporary lodging into permanent accommodation. Every year, though, the family shelter system does move between 550 to 600 individual households through the shelter system and into permanent housing. The RFP we will be doing will be strictly for hotels and motels. We will not be looking to add any scattered unit properties through the RFP process, because the vacancy rate is so low, we don't want to take any other units off the market for that purpose. So it would be strictly for hotels and motels.
Thank you. So the scope of this was just on one specific hotel, and I take it that it will be a process across the board, so that we will have it for all biddings. So I just want to make that clear.
Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think we all agree that this is not ideal for anyone to live in these kinds of situations. I mean, it's pretty hard on these families. I see it up close because it's in my ward, and it's something that we can see very clearly is problematic, and we feel for these people, and we hope to have better situations. I really appreciate the fact that we're talking about working on nonprofits or possibly building our own facilities. And I'd like your comments on that, because in this case, it's working with somebody who's a commercial person or a company or whatever. But I'd like your comments on that, because there shouldn't be profit made on these situations.
Mr. Chair, so we've had long-standing arrangements with some of the hotel and motel providers that we use. Before 2012, we had about 60 permanent beds for family shelter capacity in the city. We partnered with the YMCA, and we added capacity both in 2012 and 2015, and we now have 152 permanent rooms, which is about 604 beds in the system. In 2016, we were almost at what we would call internally Motel Zero. We were greatly reducing our use of motel stock because we had added the additional capacity. However, in 2017, we started to see a very unprecedented demand for family shelter services, being fueled in part by both migration to Ottawa, immigration to Ottawa, etc. So our plans are definitely, we are continuing to discuss with the YMCA to add additional further capacity at their facility in Argyle, where families can benefit from a great deal of wraparound services and supports. And we're also undertaking a cost-benefit analysis to look at the capital and operating costs of constructing a new purpose-built family shelter to reduce our reliance on hotels and motels.
I really appreciate hearing that, especially since the numbers doubled in 2 years, and I don't think that any of us forecast seeing it going down in the immediate future, given the pressures internationally. So I appreciate it, and I just saw the movie The Florida Project the other night, and just recommend it. It gives you a sense of people living in motel rooms. But thank you, and I hope we can work to make lives better for these newcomers to our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to thank the auditor for his report. Number two, I think every one of us can understand the stress that your staff must have been under in 2017, 2018, and even probably today with the influx of people who need accommodation, and we just don't have it. But going back, just If I understand this correctly, the City Council has delegated authority to the Housing Services Branch in order to find solutions to the accommodation issue in the city. If I understand correctly, we paid out, it's 9.3 million, I guess, in 2018. Is there a cap on how much your staff can approve in accommodation spending without having coming back to council? Like if this had been, we had to go up to 20 million, I mean, at what point do we say we have to have another opinion? We maybe have to look at some other options here and have maybe council or somebody else take, I don't know who else would it be, take a look at what we're actually spending. Does that question make sense?
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, when situations change and you see the type of numbers that you see here, it is, in our view, it's incumbent on individuals to consider alternatives.
An alternative being what, Mr. Hughes?
Well, identify the alternatives, build a business case, and staff is committed to do that in their response to the audit report. But look at what the alternatives could be, because as staff have said, this is situation normal now, and when normal changes, doing the same thing that you used to do when you had lower volumes just doesn't make sense. And so the question is, at what point do you start to look at alternatives? At what point would you go back to council? In our mind, certainly before now. And certainly staff's response to this audit report is to look at alternatives and come back with a business case, and I think that makes sense now.
Yeah. So there was no cap, though, the delegation authority had no cap on what we could spend to address this crisis?
I think you could check with staff, but our understanding is, no, it was delegated other than the budgets within the annual budgeting process.
And just one last question. So was the use of these hotels, was it cost effective? Do we know if it was cost effective right across the system?
Mr. Chair, we started to use the scattered properties because there was a need where we started to see larger families, and with larger families, we actually have to use 2 hotel rooms. We were having difficulty within our current stock finding 2 hotel rooms that were side by side. So by using these scattered properties, we were able to effectively respond, to put families in a better situation where they had cooking facilities and that within the unit. So it was a better situation for the families, and it was also saving the City of Ottawa taxpayer money.
Are they still in some of these accommodations? Are we still paying that, in some cases, $3,000 a month for a family?
So we are currently have reduced, so we've returned, as was our intention, some of the scattered units back to the rental market. We were in 8 buildings with 41 units. We're now in 3 buildings. Well, they're all attached. We consider them almost one building with 24 units. And we will continue through attrition to reduce the use of those properties also and return them back to the rental market.
And how much per month are we paying for those?
So we would be paying in and around $3,000 per month. If I may add, Mr. Chair, through the RFP process that we will be launching, we will be also looking for discounted rates for longer-term stays.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Hubley had a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on that last point, when you said you're paying $3,000, is that per family or per building? You were talking about 3 buildings there. It's per unit, $3,000 per unit. Okay. The trigger to, like when I look at the report here and see the differences from 2015 to 2018, I think most people recognize that that's refugees or immigrants that come in after the Prime Minister's tweet saying, come to Canada and we'll take care of you. The federal government was asked to contribute to pay the share for the people in that class. Are we getting that money to cover those years? I know there's been some announcements, but I don't think it's these numbers.
Mr. Chair, so the funding that we requested from the federal government was specific for refugee claimants arriving to Ottawa via the United States. So we did receive earlier this year $7.1 million, and within the last week or so, we've received an additional $10.1 million, which covers the costs that we've taken on as a municipality for that particular cohort.
And is there agreement to pay forward? Because as you're saying, these people are still in these units, creating this higher than normal demand.
Mr. Chair, I think the federal government is very open to continuing negotiations as we move forward through the year.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Like most people, one of the first questions I wanted to ask is when we're paying this kind of money is why didn't we just put this in directly into permanent housing for people rather than temporary? And the answer I was given was that it was tagged that it must be used for this purpose based on provincial funding. Is that correct?
So, Mr. Chair, the funding we receive from the provincial government that's invested in emergency shelter solutions is part of a broader envelope called the Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative funding. We receive $37.6 million from the province, which is invested in a variety of emergency shelter solutions, homelessness prevention, supportive housing, and other homelessness services. So it's very targeted. It can only be used for those specific purposes. So we can't take that money, that funding, and realign it to invest it in something like a rent supplement or a housing allowance.
Okay, I just wanted to point that out because I think that's the question on everyone's mind, because when the whole reason that this was brought up was the fact that when they see that large amount of money being used, it just shocks people, and their first question is, why don't we put them in a permanent place, and it must be cheaper to do that. Has there been any conversations with the provincial government to have some flexibility on that?
There's not, Mr. Chair, there's not currently conversations with the provincial government around the Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative funding. We are receiving or have received other pockets of funding from the provincial government, the new Ontario Priorities Housing Initiative funding, which will be investing in new development. There's another report we'll be bringing to Community and Protective Services Committee around another component. We are heavily investing in both housing allowances and rent supplements to try and move families out of the emergency shelter system into permanent housing. Every family that comes into the emergency shelter system is offered what we call a tiered housing allowance. So it's $250 for the head of household and $50 additional dollars, and that's for people to find housing of their choice in the private market, and it's portable. What we find is many of the families that come into the family shelter system are looking for the deep affordability that you find in community housing or social housing, where they're only paying 30% of their income. So we're definitely striking that balance between trying to incent people to move out of the shelter system through various provincial and local municipal housing allowances and rent supplement programs.
But clearly, we don't have enough stock at the moment, so.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions. First of all, Ms. Van Buskirk, thank you, and to the caseworkers that do incredible work in very difficult circumstances on the weekends at night in assisting new arrivals to our city in getting shelter, not accommodations, but shelter. With respect to implementing recommendation number 1, which you've agreed to, the business case to establish the capital operating costs for additional shelter space that hopefully costs less than $3,000 per month per family or per unit, what's the process on that? Will we see perhaps something this fall at budget? Will that go through CPS, Community Protective Services? Can you just give us a little bit of timeline, a little bit of process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So right now, we have our refresh of our 10-year housing and homelessness plan that's underway. That's due to the province by the end of the year, and we'll be bringing that to Community and Protective Services Committee in Q1 of 2020. So I think we'll complete the business case and take that portion of it and include it in the refresh as one of the strategies that we'll undertake to reduce family homelessness here in the city.
Does that incorporate the shelter system, the emergency, as opposed to homelessness, the emergency shelter system, which is, I think, where the nut of what we're talking about today?
Certainly under the 10-year housing and homelessness plan refresh, we're looking at a variety of different strategies around how to create more affordable housing in the city, how to address the issues more broadly of homelessness in our city, not just specific to families, but also to singles. So it will be a broad approach with numerous strategies and tactics under the 10-year plan refresh that we will bring back to CPSC and Council.
Okay. Couple of smaller questions. I was surprised to read on page 17 of the report, the insurance and workplace safety clauses were not included in some of the agreements. Why aren't they simply standard agreements that we have with suppliers where those clauses are de facto processed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Housing Service was initially intending to release an RFP for hotels and motels in 2015. And at that point in time, those requirements were to be included as just part of the general terms and conditions of that RFP we were due to release. We didn't release that RFP because in 2016, we were actually getting down to very little motel usage, and we felt that with some of the investments we were making in creating space with community partners, we actually wouldn't need to go ahead. After that, we didn't proceed ahead. It was an oversight that those were not then included in the agreements we subsequently updated.
Okay, thank you. My last question, page 21, and thank you to the Auditor General who went to Peel and to Toronto to look at practices there and benchmarking there. And as councillor, and perhaps all of us, we've assisted callers in providing direction to the shelter system through your department, and some difficulties there. Some systems are automated. Why is ours not automated why is it phone calls and phone calls? And I know it's referred to here as a couple of phone calls. Sometimes it's more complex than that. Why is it not automated and it's automated elsewhere?
Mr. Chair, so it is automated for all of the other community shelters and our family shelter in the city of Ottawa. We use a system called HIFIS, the Homelessness Individuals and Families Information System, where it's used really to book people in and out of shelters. It's where our billing originates from. One of the with the hotels and motels that we use, we're dissimilar to, say, a Toronto, as we don't take over the whole hotel and motel. We don't guarantee them business, nor do they guarantee us rooms. So I think, trying to introduce a computer system for them that's from the federal government, it's got a lot of privacy concerns around it, would not be doable. We may have one person staying in one hotel, for instance.
And the difference is that in Peel or in Toronto, they have hotels that they don't own, but that are completely emergency, dedicated to emergency shelter.
That is my understanding, yes.
Thank you. Councillor El Shantiri.
Just to follow up on the chair's question, and to our staff, is this more efficient way what Toronto and Peel doing versus what we are doing? Mind you, the stock sometimes is different, or the need are different. But is that something we should be looking at as from here on?
Mr. Chair, it's not something that we've ever explored, taking over a whole hotel for that particular purpose, nor have we had a whole hotel that would have been interested and supplying their facility for that purpose. It's definitely something that we could examine moving forward as we look at the most cost-effective way to deliver family shelter services in the city.
Well, again, I think some of my colleagues said it earlier. I want to echo that sentiment. Thank you so much for doing a great job with the number of guests we have in our city and refugee and the emergency you have to deal with, whether tornado or floods or other. So just to be commended for a job well done. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Seeing no other questions, that the Audit Committee receive and review the review of emergency shelter program use of a specific hotel and recommend that Council consider and approve the report recommendations. Is that carried? Thank you. Item number 3 on the agenda. Would Vice Chair Meehan please introduce a motion?
Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General Investigation of Cash Theft Incident, Meridian Theatres at Centrepoint was not circulated with the agenda package. Therefore, it be resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89(3) of the Procedure Bylaw, being Bylaw number 2019-8.
Merci, Madame la Conseillère. Is that carried?
Carried.
Thank you. Mr. AG or Mr. Minor?
Monsieur le Président, pour le troisième rapport, nous avons mené une enquête sur un vol de fonds qui s'est produit en novembre 2018 dans le théâtre de Meridian de Centrepoint.
Our third report this afternoon is an investigation into a cash theft incident that occurred in November of 2018 at the Meridian Theatre at Centrepoint. You'll note that some of our report has been redacted. Some of the details in the full report could potentially impact on the security of city staff and assets, and so it will not be made publicly available. The cash, $1,360, was stolen from a drop safe that was located in an office area at the Meridian Theatre. And the drop safe contains a cash float as well as cash from box office and sales and bar and merchandise sales. Now, in case you're not familiar, this is what a drop safe looks like. So staff drop an item in at the top there, in the hole in the top, then they spin the big wheel and the item falls down into the body of the safe. And then if you have the combination, you can open the main door and you can get to the item. However, you can't access items in the body of the safe once you've turned them around. You can try to stick your hand in, but you're not going to get very far. So the main objective of our review or investigation was to determine who stole the money. And we did not, in this case, we did not review the theater staff's compliance with city policies and processes regarding cash handling or look at their internal controls. And the reason is that a cash handling compliance review had been completed at the Centrepoint Theatre by the city's compliance unit in June of 2018. So we didn't feel there was value in repeating a lot of the same work. The results of our investigation, first off, was we were unable to identify the thief. The drop safe was located in an office area that was accessible to numerous staff and was not under camera surveillance at the time of the incident. 4 staff had the combination to the drop safe, and they were not required to document or log their access to the safe. And lastly, you can't tell by looking at the safe itself if the safe is closed but is not locked. So in a way, it's like your car door. You can tell when the door is closed, but you don't know if someone's actually locked it. So as a result, it would have been possible for anyone who had access to that area to open it and take the money out and without someone knowing. The second result really was that there was an inadequate control over the safeguarding of cash in the drop safe, in that it was not under camera surveillance. At the time of the incident, it was located in an open office area, and employees, volunteers, and potentially others had access to the safe. And both management, the OAG, and the Ottawa Police all were unable to identify the thief who accessed the safe, and we can't even tell really exactly when the money went missing. The results and recommendations coming out of the compliance review were provided to management in the beginning of August 2018. They included a recommendation to ensure all safes be kept in a restricted area. Management's response to this recommendation stated at the time that the drop safe would be moved. It wasn't until after the November 2018 theft that theatre management did move the drop safe to an area that was under camera surveillance. We found management's response to the identified risk was not implemented on a timely basis. And again, that's because they did not react to that, what we think is on a timely basis. And as a result, it would have reduced the probability of the theft ever occurring. And if it did occur, there would have been a much greater likelihood we could have identified the thief. And lastly, there were problems in quantifying the loss. A staff member was counted the cash that was in the safe afterwards on their own and reported the loss amount to management. And originally, $2,360 was reported. The amount was later revised to $1,360 in December, approximately 1 month after the incident. And we noted that no second person reviewed the available records that supported the initial loss calculation. And also, relying on one person to count the cash after the incident increased the risk of further cash theft and the risk of relying on inaccurate information. Having two people participate in the counting of the cash in the drop safe would have mitigated these risks. So if you would have had someone together going through it at the same time, it would have made, we think it would have made more sense. So we made 3 recommendations, and management has agreed to implement all of them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Auditor General. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you confirm that the safe has been moved? Have you been back over to do a spot check? Or?
Yes, I confirm. Yeah, we were there about I think we were there 14 days after the after the report. Well, no, sorry, not 14 days after the potential theft, because it took a while till it was reported to us, and the drop safe had been moved at that time, and we physically observed it in a safer location.
So it wasn't moved right away, though.
It was moved sometime after the theft and before we got there. So there was a window in there, and it was moved sometime within that window. I don't know. I can't recall exactly the day that it was moved.
Maybe Mr. Chenier wants to come up, because I'd like to, if I could, Mr. Chair, ask a question about accountability on this process. We have, thank you, Mr. Chenier. We have a situation where we sat here in audit committee. The AG made very helpful, in my view, recommendations that we move the safe in June. And here we are back here again with this situation. So I'd like to hear from you the accountability that should have been in place then, but certainly must be there now.
Mr. Chair, yes, happy to clarify on that. Certainly in June, the cash management folks did come in and did observe that one of the 3 safes at the site was sitting out as mentioned by the auditor, in a general staff work area, essentially a cubicle area. Like many city facilities that are older, these types of situations where safes are in locations that are not necessarily ideal from a security perspective. This was the case at Meridian. The June review of this did suggest that the safe should be within an area that has a camera on it, and we agreed with that. Staff at the center set about to try to find an ideal location that was secure but also within camera range, and the options were not many. They looked at a more permanent solution that would require construction at the site, essentially the building of what is commonly known as a counting room, a separate room with limited access, a table to count the cash, a safe, preferably a swipe and a key-in type access. What they should have done immediately is found a temporary location to do that. One was available, and in fact, as mentioned by Mr. Minor, shortly after the theft, the safe was moved and is now in a temporary location that is secure and under camera, but again, not ideal as a counting room as the final destination for this. A room will require retrofitting in order to provide all of the amenities that I just talked about, and we're going to do that, but for now, safe is secure and under camera.
Okay, you raised the point that there's other locations as well that the city has these operations. Is there a review, it took the AG coming in and to make a suggestion that there be a camera or that this would be covered under a camera. That troubles me. I would have thought our corporate security folks would have made a recommendation that there be some kind of secure facility for this to begin with before the safe was even put in there. But given that it wasn't, is there a review of other locations across the city, anywhere where we're handling taxpayers' dollars in the kind of volumes that you're looking at a number of these places? Is there a review underway to make sure that we are doing all we can to protect the taxpayer?
Mr. Chair, yes, and bear in mind we're talking about over 100 locations, some of them in buildings that were really built before any of this cameras or drop safes were in place. We are reviewing. Roughly 30% of our facilities right now are fully compliant. Some are compliant in terms of security of the safe, but don't necessarily have a camera. Some have a camera, but need adjustments. As recommended by the auditor, we did put out as soon as we received the recommendations, direction to staff to check positioning of camera to make sure that on a regular basis, those that do have cameras on them are in fact capturing the proper image of the front of the safe, the area where one would go to access the safe to remove funds.
So my last question, and let us know if you need this as a direction or it just makes sense as management that you might want to do this. Can you assure us in the sites that are not 100% secure yet that staff have been told to keep the safes locked so that we don't have a situation of an unsecure safe open at any time, and that you've instituted the AG's recommendation that there always be 2 people present when they're counting the money or handling anything out of that safe? Can we get that assurance, or do you need a direction?
Mr. Chair, yes, that has been done. We have advised staff there is a possibility of human error in this case where the safe was perhaps not properly locked. And so that has been issued to staff, as well as a directive that in the case where there is a significant cash discrepancy, and that could be theft, but it could be misplacement, or that, as recommended by the Auditor General, more than one person be involved in counting out and creating the reconciliation of the funds and documenting what is observed. So we have sent that out broadly to all our facilities, asking for compliance to these parameters.
The only word I don't like in that, Mr. Chenier, is asking. Like, there has to be a very strong commitment to taxpayers that we're taking every step. So I'm hoping it's a little more than asking and that there's consequences.
Mr. Chair, it was a directive to staff.
Okay.
Wrong word.
Okay, thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor El-Shantier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I heard the Deputy Auditor talk about police was involved, but as I look at the report, I don't see any police involved here. Did I miss something? Was the police called to this case, or was a police report about this?
Yes, the police were involved in this, and they came and they reported back. they did report back that they were closing the case, and in my understanding, it was for the same reason that there could have been quite a number of people.
But it's not in your report, correct? Am I correct, or I miss it somewhere?
I'll have to take a look at that more
Okay,
closely. sir.
that's fine. I'm okay. But my question to our staff, we've seen this and obviously is dealt with, and have we considered not using cash anymore? A lot of places now, they have ATM, they have other way of payment than using cash. Is that something possible in those matters?
Mr. Chair, we have not considered eliminating cash completely. Bear in mind that this is the theater with the front bar, concessions. Often promoters would have things for sale, those kinds of things. There is an ATM. There is the opportunity to take credit and debit, but we have not eliminated cash completely. And at this point, we have not considered that in any of our operations as a way forward.
Well, I see the management agree with some of the recommendation, but I mean, you read through this, and I know we're talking about a small amount of number, but you wonder how could that been unmanaged. So, and that's why some places, in order to avoid all this process, they have a ticket purchase or just to eliminate the cash possibility, because we know whenever there's cash involved and there's going to be more staffing or more accountability in place, whereas you can eliminate that if let's see, even if the bar, but they can use the ticket from the staff, and those staff they deposit them. I'm not sure if there is a way just to reduce that number.
Wherever possible, Chair, we are looking at doing that. For example, in our swimming pools, we encourage people to buy memberships so that they're not paying every time. But bear in mind that some of these are impulse purchases at the time. You go to the theater and you want a drink or you want something to eat. I think for now it would be very difficult from a customer service perspective to operate a theater or a swimming pool or a lot of our facilities on a no cash basis. We may evolve to that eventually, but presently I think we still receive probably a declining amount from cash, but it isn't zero yet, and I think we would get quite a bit of pushback from our clientele if we took that bold step and eliminated cash altogether.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanaugh, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the report. One of the biggest surprises to me was the recommendation 2, that asking about 2 staff be present at cash counts. I thought that was so obvious, and so, I was on the audit committee for school board, and probably one of the biggest headaches we had was those, bake sales and school funds that were collected cash and money went missing. And it was, due to the fact that, you're working with volunteers and things go missing, and they tarnish the reputation of the school sometimes because it was so problematic. But the recommendation was always that there's always, two people in front of cash. Is this not something that we do across the board everywhere, like that we have this recommendation? I assume you're not just making it for this particular incident, but that anything to do with cash, that 2 people be present.
Mr. Chair, through to the council, I think the cash handling policy addresses the normal issues where it is recommended that 2 people handle cash. This is an extraordinary situation, and that's why we reminded staff to. We recommended staff to point out to staff that when the extraordinary situation occurs, for the protection of everyone, 2 people should be present when they count that.
I appreciate that. I was hoping that is truly the policy across the city, because it's just so necessary and one of the simplest ways to prevent these problems. Thank you very much for the report.
Thank you, Chair. Just following up, Mr. Chenier, you said 30%, well, just to back up. So if I can understand correctly, we have 100 services or that we deliver across the city that involve a safe because we're handling cash. Is that approximately right? or is
Probably
that-
more than 100. It's
Yeah.
all our recreation facilities, complexes, museums. Most of those would, on a regular basis, take in cash, credit, multiple forms of payment.
And have they ever, do we know if any of these have had losses in the past? Or is this unusual at the Meridian Theatre?
It's relatively unusual at the Meridian Theatre and across the board to have, there are shortages and overages like any operation. Thefts are relatively unusual in our facility of cash because they are deposited in safes. Not all our facilities have cameras, and so when I said 30% would be fully compliant, not every city recreation or cultural building necessarily has a camera system in them. They would likely have a safe if they take in money, but often they are 1 or 2 room buildings that probably will not have a camera in the immediate future since the network has not expanded that broadly and probably doesn't have the capacity to. Of the large buildings, sportsplex, large recreation facilities, almost all of them now are fully compliant in that they have a safe and the safe is within the camera zone. Where we have to look at other measures, and we will look to our friends in finance, cash management, to look at how do we further mitigate risks in buildings where we don't have cameras.
And well, you said 30% of the 100 or so facilities are safe, so that means 7 and 10 you're working on? That's a lot.
What I was saying is that the standard that we have set here of having a safe in a safe room with a camera on it is at about a 30% level. Bearing in mind that some facilities don't have cameras, some facilities don't take in cash, they would have, if they do take in cash, they would have a safe, the money would be secure, but it wouldn't simply have a camera on it. And we will look in those cases at what other measures need to be taken to make sure that situations of theft or those kinds of things are properly addressed.
Okay. Just one last question. Of the incidents at the Meridian Theatre, can you determine whether it was an employee who made off with the cash, or could it possibly be somebody else?
Mr. Chair, I'll answer that. The answer can't be determined. When we looked at the number of individuals who had access to that area over the couple of days that it could have happened, there were so many people who would go through this area in the normal course of their work. It wasn't possible, and more importantly, if the safe was locked, there would only be 4 people who could potentially have done this. If the safe wasn't locked, then it could have been anyone who could gain access, including tradespeople or people who just who were visiting staff who legitimately work in that area. So it was just so broad over such a period of time. It just wasn't possible to know whether it was a staff person, and that's what's always unfortunate when you don't have all of the facilities available, controls in place. We talked about this when we had the other thefts at client service centers. When you don't have, when you're not following all the proper policies and procedures and controls that are put in place, when the cameras aren't appropriately aimed at the individuals who are handling cash, it unfortunately means that people who are quite innocent are placed under suspicion, even though someone else who works in that area or a coworker is the one who has perpetrated the theft. And that's what makes it more unfortunate. It's not just the loss of $1,400. It's the fact that some individuals who did absolutely nothing wrong were placed under suspicion for a period.
Okay. Just a little bit of follow-up. I'm sorry, I said the last question. Mr. Chenier, you said something about we might have to retrofit or find a room that's locked, blah, blah, we lost $1,400, but if we follow standard procedures where two people, like the safe must be locked, there's two people who must count the cash, you could just pull a table up, count the cash with those two people, they sign off, and I mean, we don't really have a lot of money to be spending on adding rooms and special rooms and locks and things like that. If everybody was to follow it to the letter of the law, could we avoid having to do things like that?
Mr. Chair, first let me clarify that there is double sign-off on regular deposits. So we're not, what we're talking about here is a situation where there wasn't a policy specific to when cash goes missing. And that's where we've instituted the double counting of the money that is missing, so the reconciliation. The reconciliation in normal times when money isn't missing at the end of every day or half day, as you will, depending on size of operations, should happen in a secure area, ideally where with limited access, a safe right on hand, and a camera so that it's all properly documented. At Meridian, that currently doesn't exist in that sense. We have identified a room that I believe was a kitchenette of some sort in the past, no longer in use. Our intent is to install a camera in that room, do a bit of millwork so that a table can go in there, and then only to have staff that actually need to be involved in cash reconciliation in that room. Because the current other alternatives are good temporary solutions, but we think that given the size of this operation, that we need a permanent solution that will address all of the security needs.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you all. Just a few comments and questions, Mr. Chénier. You know, we've dealt with cash management issues at this committee before, at client service centers, and before June 2018, and it is very upsetting that after the cash compliance review of June 2018, that the safe was not moved. It certainly would have reduced the risk, might not have prevented this issue, but certainly would have reduced the risk. And what we have here, as was pointed out, $1,300 is a lot of money, but now we have employees who may still be under suspicion. You know, certainly from, if there were 4 employees that had access to the safe, if the safe was locked, and we don't know. And that's where the real loss is. And so I want you to make sure that you and your management teams in recreation and in all city departments that handle cash take that for the important issue that it is. It is the impact on our honest employees when something like this goes and it's unsolved. You said, Mr. Chénier, there's 3 safes at Meridian. Is that what I understood?
That's correct.
I did not know that. As part of the cash compliance review of June 2018, were there any recommendations for those other counting areas or safe areas? And my follow-up question is, have those recommendations been implemented?
I don't believe so. The 2 safes, the 2 other safes are in front of cameras in a secure room. That is where the 3rd safe was subsequently moved after the theft.
Okay. I won't ask why we need 2 safes in the same area. That's an operational issue, but there you go. Want to ask the Auditor General, your report says 4 people had the combination to the safe. Is that evening or in that period from November 6th to November 8th, or is that in total at the Meridian Theatre, 4 people that have access, the combination to the safe?
At the time, Chair, that was in total. There were 4 individuals who had the combination.
Were they all working or scheduled or on shift between the 6th to the 8th, to your knowledge, or Mr. Chénier?
One of them we know was not. So it was really who was not understanding was not working at that time in the area. The other 3 were in the area. Whether or not they had access, specific, whether or not they came in through the door, can't guarantee all 3 of them did. It would not surprise me if they did, because they were working in that area.
Okay. And the safe was in an area where, while it may or may not have been locked, one needed a swipe card access to enter that room. Is that correct?
That is correct. It was an office area, if I were guessing, I'd say maybe about half the size of this room.
Thank you.
And so full of
And
cubicles. And
those
it was
logs
swipe
were
access.
examined as part of the police investigation?
Correct, and we reviewed them as well. By way of example, there were, on a given day, there were 170 swipes going in or out. So you didn't have to swipe to go out, but it would record the time of an exit, and then it recorded every entrance going in by whose card went in. So it was quite a number and quite a bit of activity.
Okay. Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I would like to, let me get the wording. That the Audit Committee received the investigation of cash theft incident Meridian Theatre at Centrepoint, recommends that Council consider and approve the report recommendations. Is that carried? Thank you. I would ask Councillor Kavanagh to introduce a motion for item number 4, please.
Thank you. Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General Report on Fraud and Waste Hotline was not circulated with the agenda package, therefore be it resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89.3 of the Procedure Bylaw, being Bylaw number 2019-8.
Thank you very much. Is that carried? Thank you all. Mr. Auditor General or Mr. Deputy Auditor General?
Monsieur le Président et les membres du comité, la politique en matière de fraude et des abus définit les responsabilités du vérificateur général et des personnels et des gestionnaires. Et chaque année, c'est le bureau de vérificateur général qui livre le rapport annuel sur les activités de la ligne directe de fraude et d'abus. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, the fraud and waste policy identifies the responsibility of the Office of the Auditor General, city staff, and managers. A fraud and waste hotline is a best practice for accountability and transparency. It's an important component of an organization that wishes to demonstrate and communicate and live with a high level of ethical practices. And the mere existence of this line and the success of this line is another indication that the city is accountable and transparent. I don't have to remind the committee that these reports have led to audits and investigative reviews in the past, and they form an important part of our planning for the annual work plan. Although not always quantifiable, these reports save money in the future and have led to the recovery of losses concerned. Remembering, and we've talked about this at this committee before, in any organization, in any village, in any company, in any municipality, there are 3 types of individuals. There are those individuals that will always do what they're told and will always act appropriately. There are those individuals that, when given an opportunity, will not act appropriately, will not follow rules, and will misbehave. And then there are those individuals that, if they think there's a possibility that they are not going to get caught, will misbehave. And it is the existence of lines like this and the communication to the public and to employees that ensure that those individuals who might fall into that last category, that they are made aware of a system that identifies misbehavior, if you will, and could lead to the possibility of them getting caught. So originally, the Fraud and Waste Hotline was developed to give a voice to employees that would allow them to identify issues without fear of repercussion. And recognized in the past that the existence of this line contributed to a safe and secure workplace, and the fraud and waste hotline was extended to residents and taxpayers. The fraud and waste hotline also serves other benefits in that it has helped us identify areas of inefficiency or waste throughout the city in the past. Don't have to remind the members of the committee that there are certainly some obvious examples of fraud, forgery or theft. Some, as we spoke about today in the Center Point issue, irregularities in the handling of money. But there are less obvious issues. Think of individuals who would either manipulate data improperly or destroy data, or people who are misusing city property or equipment. Those would be less obvious examples of fraud. Et aussi, Monsieur le Président, dans le monde d'abus, il y a quelques exemples d'abus, par exemple des employés sans affectation et des activités qui réduisent la productivité. Cependant, l'abus vu au-delà de ces exemples. Tout ce qui nuit au bon fonctionnement du milieu de travail constitue de l'abus. Un superviseur, par exemple, qui est irrespectueux, l'intimidation de collègues ou des frictions de toutes sortes peuvent mener à des abus. In the workplace, there are obvious examples of abuse, and it could be where there's the overuse of resources. A number of years ago, we talked about the application of SALT in an audit report. Individuals that, whether it be the employees or suppliers who are not following expectations. We talked about an example a couple of years ago when we tested asphalt provided by a supplier. They were delivering asphalt that didn't meet the city's expectations. And of course, there are also actions that reduce activity in the workplace, and they could be employees who haven't been assigned work. They could be a disrespectful supervisor or bullying or harassment that occurs in the workplace. Any of those activities can lead to waste. So the policy applies to all City of Ottawa employees except councillors and their staff, the police service, the public library staff, and I should point out that the public library has their own fraud and waste hotline that parallels ours, and if we receive a fraud and waste complaint for the public library, we provide that to the public library to review. And the Community Housing Corporation has introduced their own fraud and waste hotline that is also built in parallel to ours. Those reports don't come to us, but should we receive a report through our hotline that belongs to Community Housing Corporation, we send it off to them as well. So, le rôle de vérificateur général, pour nous, l'activité principale du bureau du vérificateur général selon l'année, l'administration de la ligne réclame environ 2 équivalents temps plein, soit approximativement un quart de notre ressource humaine. This is a significant activity for the Office of the Auditor General and certainly depends on the year. Generally, the administration consumes roughly 2 full-time equivalents, or just under a quarter of our staff resources. In addition to administering the hotline, we also provide the corporate expertise in fraud examination. There are currently 3 certified fraud examiners in the office, and there's one more seeking that certification. We receive all of the reports ourselves, and then we determine whether it's something that we will investigate ourselves or pass it on to management. And naturally, we liaise with the city solicitor where necessary, and before the police are contacted, there is a requirement within the policy that the city solicitor and the Auditor General communicate. So the roles and duties of staff are very clear within the policy. They are to report any violations of code of conduct or any fraud and waste that they examine, and they also have a role to play in investigation. And I should point out that 95% of the examinations are reviewed by staff under the direction of the Office of the Auditor General, and when the investigation is done by staff, we sign off on it, and we may request additional information if we felt that there are areas that should be addressed, and those are included in this report that we're bringing you today. So the hotline is designed to be confidential and anonymous should the reporter wish to maintain their anonymity. We use third parties to operate the call center, and a third party who operates and manages the website for us. It's accessible through the phone and via the internet, and it's accessible to all residents and employees. It operates 24/7, and over the last couple of years, we've made a number of improvements to make it phone friendly, and we're finding that we can see that when we talk about some of the reports. So, nous pouvons dire que le volume sont stables par rapport cette année en comparaison de l'année précédente. Cette année, dans 2018, nous avons reçu 190 signalements. So we can, the volume of reports are stable in comparison to last year. This year we received 109 reports, and you can see with the chart that there have been some peaks, but generally we're probably in a period of stability at this point in time. We've always said that every year that the number of reports coming from public versus employees swings between 60 and 40%, and this year we see the same thing. 57% of reports came from the public. Last year it was 60%, and it's always bounced between those two figures. Certainly, le pourcentage des signalements faits sur l'Internet augmente progressivement. We can see that the number of reports that we receive by the Internet is growing. This year it was 75%. Last year it was 69%. 2 years ago it was 65%. So certainly we attribute some of that to the fact that people are moving that way, but certainly the changes that we made to the website to make it mobile friendly, we believe have contributed to that as well. We, over the last 2 years, we made some changes to the look of the fraud and waste hotline. We began by making some changes to the look on the website itself, making it, it was starting to look dated. It was 15 years old, and now it's got a little fresher look. And there's been increased, as we promised last year, there's been increased promotion of the line during 2018. There were 2 examples where the fraud and waste hotline was promoted in the loop to all employees with the introduction of a short video, which it's about, I think it's about 3 minutes long, and it talks about the value of the fraud and waste hotline. There was a new poster that was designed. The first time the poster was printed in 15 years, and that was distributed across the city this past year. And one of the things that we do with our auditors is their responsibility when they're in a particular part of the city doing their audits. One of their responsibilities is to look to see that the posters are there. The committee will recall that when we talked about the incidents that happened at the long-term care facility, there was no reference at all within the facilities, any facility for the fraud and waste hotline, and we found that there was a very poor level of awareness on the part of staff about the fraud and waste hotline, and that's what led to the increased communications that was done in cooperation between management and the Office of the Auditor General. La ligne directe de fraude et d'abus est conçue de façon à permettre une communication bidirectionnelle. The fraud and waste hotline is designed to allow and to facilitate anonymous two-way communications, and that performs a number of functions. If we receive a report from an individual, and it's just obvious to us that there doesn't appear to be enough information to allow anyone to conduct an investigation, it allows us to ask a question of the reporter, and without disclosing that, the identity of the individual, that individual can either sign into the system, or if they've given the system their email, they can log into the system because they're given a unique password and ID, and they can see questions that we might ask or any refinement that we might see, which will make it easier for those doing the investigation. And you can see that this year again, about near 50% of the individuals reviewed the reports, and that's consistent with prior years as well. The other thing that we report every year, Mr. Chair, is the number of investigations that are outstanding. And you can see that as of the end of 2017, there were about 4 reports outstanding. And at the end of 2018, there's a small typo on that screen, I'm sorry. Oh, it's been corrected on the screen, but not on my document here. So as you can see, at the end of the year, there was about the same number of outstanding, which means that they're being investigated at the same rate that they're arriving, which is good. A number of years ago at committee, we talked about identifying in greater detail the resolution of some of the reports after the investigation was completed. And in 2018, 27 of the reports, or 15% of them, were fully substantiated. 36, or about 19% of them, were found to be accurate. In other words, the reporter was reporting something that was absolutely correct, but the activity that they saw was compliant with city policies. There's no wrongdoing. 54 reports, or about 20, just about a third of them, a quarter of them did not give enough information for us to ensure that an investigation would complete. And in most of those, in almost all of those cases, those reports don't go any farther than our office. 53 were found to be not applicable, and those would be ones that we would send on to another organization, or ones that are being sent to us, and it's not. It might be something that applies to the federal government, for example. Fully 24 were found to be inaccurate, and I can tell you that the level of substantiation is a little bit higher than the industry average, which is 9 to 10%. We're seeing 15%. So what kind of items arose from the hotline, Mr. Chair? Nous n'entrons pas dans les détails concernant les cas réels, des allégations fondées, par exemple, qui ont été fermées en 2018. Des informations limitées pouvant être mises à disposition tout en protégeant la vie privée des individus sont détaillées dans le rapport. Mais I can, without going into too much detail, talk to you generally about some of the substantiated cases that we found. And of course, we do this to protect the identity of individuals in the report, and that would include the identity of the reporter and, in some cases, the identity of the perpetrator. So with that limitation, here are some of the substantiated reports that we closed last year. Under the category of unauthorized use or misuse of city property or time, there was a small number of employees that have worked a unique work schedule since 2012 that wasn't properly set up in the payroll system. As such, certain statutory holidays occurred. When certain statutory holidays occurred, some of the employees took a flex day, resulting in overpayments of approximately $7,100. The recovery of the overpayment has been arranged, and all employees have been removed from this work schedule. The payroll system now properly reflects the work that they do, and they're being paid appropriately. The city purchased 6 trucks and attachments to plow snow and spread salt on OC Transport properties. Prior to putting the trucks in service, it was found that once attachments were installed, the vehicle's front axles were overloaded, and the vehicles couldn't perform the work that they were purchased for with the equipment that was purchased for them. This situation occurred because the city-created chart used to access vehicle weight capacities was incomplete, and not all required technical specifications have been included in the request for tender used to purchase the trucks. As a result, the attachments had to be removed from these vehicles, and 6 additional replacement trucks were purchased and retrofitted with the original attachments. The oversight resulted in additional costs to the city of about $82,000, primarily due to the cost of removing the attachments from one brand of vehicles and installing them then on another brand in future. The vehicles were repurposed. In future, Fleet Services will oversee OC Transpo's operational support and maintenance vehicle purchases to prevent this from happening again. An employee was taking a city vehicle to their private residence without authorization, and as a result, the individual with their supervisor submitted a vehicle taxable benefit form, and the personal use of the vehicle is now added to the employee's T4s, increasing their personal income for the benefit of accessing a city vehicle. Under the category of violation of laws, regulations, policies, or procedures, a residential property owner was residing in their home without an occupancy permit. Building Code Services got involved, and an outstanding inspection was performed, and an occupancy permit was issued. Without an occupancy permit, the value of the property is understated on the tax rolls, and that individual is not paying their fair share of taxes. In another instance, because it's a property owner's responsibility to replace or install sewer service connections on private property and to have these connections inspected by city staff, a resident obtained valid permits for plumbing and road cut work to connect to the city's sanitary sewer system. 2 years later, the required inspections had not been done. The resident was directed to obtain the outstanding inspections, and depending on the circumstances and location, it might be an instance where the individual is not paying their fair share of the costs of the sewage treatment costs. There was an organization that wasn't registered as a nonprofit, and they received a subsidized rental rate. That was corrected in recreational services. In another department, a manager hired family members in contravention with city policies and procedures and in violation of the union agreement. A letter of warning was given to the manager, and refresher training was given to all supervisors in the area. Under the category of alcohol or drug abuse or other substance abuse, there was a case where 2 city employees were regularly smoking cannabis in a city vehicle during work hours. The 2 employees were terminated. But just for clarification, this incident occurred before cannabis legalization, but I can point out that the result would still have been the same. Under the category of theft, there are 5 instances of theft. An employee who processed cash receipts stole money on an ongoing basis. It's estimated that the loss was about $2,000. The employee resigned, and management initiated a review of controls in that area. In another instance, an employee committed theft of about $1,100. Once again, the employee resigned and agreed to a repayment, agreed to repay the city. And should the former employee fail to pay the agreement, the matter will be referred to the Ottawa Police. Another employee did not apply the appropriate processing fees to a number of city documents for a period of 3 years, and resulted in revenue losses of under $10,000. But because of because of other failures in their performance of duties, there was a further loss of another $600. The processes and controls in that area were changed, because of an arbitration between the union and the city, the results of that arbitration are confidential. The City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund, this is for old employees of the former City of Ottawa, was not advised of the death of a pensioner, resulting in an $86,000 overpayment. A repayment schedule was agreed to and payments have commenced. If the agreed schedule is not respected, the city has the right to pursue legal action with the individual. The City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund has changed the processes, and the committee will remember that we added an audit of the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund to our 2019 audit work plan. We are just in the processes of finishing that audit, and we'll be debriefing staff on that shortly, which means that you should see this later in the fall. One incident, a resident provided the city with 2 quotes to repair damages that were allegedly caused by a city vehicle to their property. There was some irregularity in the quotes that they submitted to the city. The claim was put on hold and the case was referred to the Ottawa Police. And finally, under the category of harm to people or potential harm to people, there was a number of cases that we've reported on previously, as well as some that we may have seen in the press. An employee committed criminal misconduct against a resident of a city's long-term care facility, and the employee was terminated. An employee verbally abused a resident at a city long-term care facility and was terminated. And then you'll recall the 3 separate reports that we presented to Audit Committee in 2018, the review of medication management, the investigation into the reporting of an incident at a City of Ottawa long-term care, and then a review of the city's practices for the procurement of commercial vehicles. So in summary, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, the hotline is a best practice. It's clear that it's still well received by the public and the staff. And the significant value of the Fraud and Waste Hotline is that it continues to contribute to the improvement of the ethical culture of the city. And we will continue. Management has also committed to increasing the publication of the Fraud and Waste Hotline, and expect to have continued response from staff and residents in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. And up on the screen, or not anymore, thank you for all the staff at the Office of the Auditor General for your work. Councillor El Shantieri, if you have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a question to the auditor. As being a former businessman, we always count for, obviously, it's not necessarily fraud, but it's a waste in a business. Like every business has percentage of waste. And I understand this is a taxpayer's dollar and we are the custodians of the taxpayer's money. But in your opinion, is the city is well run, consider we are $3.6 billion budget, we receive so much money or so much in cash and other. Like in comparison, when you talk about you have 17,000 employees between full-time and a part-time, do you think we have a fundamental issue here, or do you think this is compared to other large municipalities of our size, because we don't have the Ombuds report, the provincial comparable. So I'm asking you, have you checked with other municipalities of our size and see where do we fit when it comes to these things?
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, it's a similar question that I've answered before, and let me begin by saying, in any organization, there is always room for improvement, and that's at the highest level down to the lowest level. And I believe that it's incumbent on every manager to continually ask themselves, can I do better than I'm already doing? And they, in turn, should be asking that of their employees. And certainly, one of the ways that you can continuously improve is compare yourself against other organizations that are much like you. And one of the benefits of the OMBI process was you had the opportunities to compare your activity against a similar activity in other municipalities. They're not always comparable, but when you begin to compare, when you start to see the differences through investigation, and I say that as an experienced manager, you can identify where you compare and where you don't compare, and that's where you focus. That's where you focus on why is another manager in another municipality delivering a similar activity able to deliver something for less than I can in my municipality. And in some cases, there are things that are available to them that aren't available to you. But by focusing on where the differences are, that's when you can become better. And at the very least, what you should be looking at is comparing. If you're not going to look outside the city, and my suggestion is that everyone should compare themselves to their peers in other municipalities. If you're not going to look outside the city, then constantly look at yourself, comparing yourself against your own activity and challenging yourself and your managers to see if you can do better. And when we report to council on some of the things that we look at, we ourselves look to see what other municipalities are doing. We talked about it in the case of what other municipalities were doing with the emergency shelter program, and we found that other municipalities, in response to the same sort of activity that we were seeing here in Ottawa, that a couple of them went out and used an RFP process to make arrangements with a community to ensure themselves that they were getting the best value for their taxpayers. And certainly that came from seeing a significant change in their activity and asking themselves, what can we do different? What can we do now that our activity is higher than it used to be? So that's a long way of answering your question. I believe that in any organization, there's always opportunity to be more efficient, but only if people are constantly comparing themselves and asking themselves what improvements they can make to be more efficient.
I cannot agree with you more about this, but what I'm really trying to put a contact is our municipality, the size of our city, the size of our budget, the size of our employee, compared to other practice in other municipalities of our size. Where do we fit? Are we in good position, or are we in? Because this is important, because no longer we contribute to the Ombuds report, so we don't know what other municipality of our size are doing. And I'm interested in this. And I know sometimes we read something about, some inefficient way happen, and I'm pretty sure anyone been in business will understand sometimes you make the wrong purchase, or sometimes you make mistake, or sometimes your staff burn half a dozen pizza, whatever the case may be. We understand when you run a business or when you run a corporation, there is some loss somewhere. I want to know, where do we fit in comparable to other municipality, whether in Ontario or in Canada, it doesn't matter, if we know that information.
Well, I can tell you that as a city, I don't think that's known. I mean, especially, you talk about OMBI. There were some aspects of OMBI that were absolutely difficult to compare. The comparisons didn't make sense, but there were aspects of OMBI that adequately demonstrated that the city of Ottawa was as efficient as could be, or was one of the most efficient, or even indicated in some areas that there was room for improvement. But the real value of OMBI comes from not continually doing the same thing year after year after year, but from changing it up from time to time and challenging yourself to look at other areas that haven't been measured before. I think what happened with Ombi is it was a good idea that got a little stale, and I know, for example, at the very beginning, the first there were a number of managers that went out to compare themselves against their peers, and when they found that there were some municipalities that they just couldn't compare to because the differences were so great, they just focused on a small part of Ombi, and dropping out of Ombi was a decision that was made. Maybe it should have been a selective, but there's material still available that can be reviewed and can be used without participating in Ombi.
Okay.
But there's nothing wrong with managers of the city contacting their peers in other municipalities if it's important to them and asking information of those other municipalities. They see them at conferences.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Audit, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just one question, and I don't know if maybe you're the person to ask, Mr. Hughes, is the reports submitted by employees in 2019, management reported 6 such cases to the fraud of mismanagement or fraud to the fraud hotline. I'm wondering, why would management report to the fraud hotline? Wouldn't they just take discipline themselves?
Management is required by the policy to report it.
Okay.
One of the things that we could probably refine in that policy is a time period. For example, there was a delay in reporting the theft at Meridian Theatre. Certainly a timely report it may not have changed the outcome, but it certainly increases the likelihood that.
So they would report the incident to the crime, and then they can take their own disciplinary action as a manager?
The discipline activity always resides with manager. That doesn't come out of our office at all. So they report the incident. We decide if we're going to participate in the investigation. In the case of Meridian at Centrepoint, we did, but we don't participate in the disciplinary
I
action.
wasn't aware that the managers had to report to the fraud hotline. I thought they would report to city somehow, but this is how they do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
Conseillère Cavanaugh, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. I wanted to talk about of all the things that were reported, probably the most significant one was on the long-term care. And it doesn't really fall under, I don't consider it fraud, or it's to do with just human dignity, and it's actually a crime. Was that one that came from the public? That was reporting from the public? It wasn't in that particular one?
Mr. Chair, there were a number of activities that took place in long-term care at the time, and there was a report to us through the Fraud and Waste Hotline that came in around the time where there were a number of other reports in the media about what was going on at the long-term care. And when we were in the long-term care investigating the reporting of the assault, we noticed ourselves that there were poor controls over the handling of medication. So although we were investigating one issue, we started another review over the controls over medication because of what we found when we were in there. So
you were talking about the importance of comparing to other municipalities. How did we fare in this respect on long-term care?
We didn't do a comparison.
You didn't. Okay.
With long-term care, but the managers of long-term care may informally compare themselves to other operations similar to theirs. I do not know at this point.
Okay, this is good to know. It's one thing that I'd like to see looked into, because there are programs out there about improving the situation. For example, the butterfly model, and hopefully these can resolve some of these issues. So it's good to have something to look into. Like, obviously we have to do something different, and I appreciate that this was looked into. I think that this is important, just to have this feature, just to give the public, you know, the opportunity to feel like they can participate, even if they're wrong, you know, in terms of the, you know, misunderstanding what is fraud or waste. I think it's good just to have those clarifications. So I think if nothing else, it's a very educational tool in terms of letting us know what is within the city, and maybe we do have to rethink things sometimes, but I really appreciate and thank you for the report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up with the AG on the issue of the oversight over the fleet management. Is there other parts of the city that are doing their own fleet management, or have we not started? Because there was an earlier audit to do with fleet management as well, and I thought we were trying to make a move towards that fleet management would be involved in the procurement process in some way, shape, or form. Is that not the case? Is there still areas that are doing their own thing without the value of their expertise?
So for the most part, I'm Don Nell, Director of Fleet Services. So for the most part, we take care of almost all acquisitions for the entire city now. There are some exceptions, like police, for example, they have their own provincial procurement process that's very efficient and they don't need us. But with the exception of buses and those police vehicles, we pretty much take care of everything else.
So just one question on that part. So when you're doing a purchase for, say, any department, they tell you what they need. Do they also help you with like the requirements from that department? Because I don't want to see it move 100% under you, because there is a value that, for example, OC Transpo can add to what they need in their certain vehicles, or, you know, if the day comes where you have oversight over the police, obviously the police fleet management, obviously their input would be very valuable to that. So is that how the process works, or no?
So generally, yes. So annually, we go through every piece of equipment in the entire city, go reach out to each one of the managers of those areas, make sure we understand those vehicles are due for replacement, or do they still meet your need? We make sure we get their updated needs, and then we move forward with procurement after that.
Okay, thank you. So then I'll just come back to the fraud and waste report in general. I'd like to make a comment, Mr. Chair, if I could, that this is one of my favorite reports that we receive every year, because to me, what this shows the taxpayer is that the Auditor General and we as a council take their concerns very seriously. And I don't put it on a scale of if you're looking at a loss of $20 or a loss of $20 million, it's still taxpayers' money, and to them, it's very important that we be responsible for it. So I appreciate the report that you do here. I also think I'd like to acknowledge with Mr. Kanlakis as well, because I know the work that he's done with your office to make the whole process work a little better. As you mentioned earlier to one of the other questions about the reporting between management and the AG, I think the public should know that there's a really good level of cooperation there, and the fact that you have the city manager and the AG paying attention to these files that come in, whatever the scale of the file is, I think that sends a very important message to taxpayers. So I want to thank you both for working together on that and helping us show taxpayers that we do take their money seriously. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kanlakis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hoovley. Thank you all. A couple of questions. Is there anyone here who can answer questions from property standards or permits? My question to staff, my question is, on page 8 of the report, two items, the third and fourth item, deal with permits and an occupancy permit and a road cut permit and residents who moved in and who didn't follow up. My question to staff is, what is the system within the City of Ottawa to follow up on open permits so that we do the inspections that are required, so that the correct property taxes are charged, and on the fourth item, so that the installation of a sewer service connection from a private property to the city services is properly inspected. Hello. In these two cases, it was reported by through the Fraud and Waste Hotline, but what is the process within the city to follow up on permits that have not been closed, that have not been permitted, that have not been inspected?
Mr. Chair, hi, I'm Cork Curry, manager of the right-of-way. I'll just speak to the road cut permits that were involved in those two specific instances. As committee may know, we recently redid our road activity bylaw 3 months ago. It was before council, and so as a result, we put all new business processes in place as of Canada Day this year. We're in the process now of rolling those out this week, and we now have a standard service timeline of 5 days for an inspection permit, and then they're reviewed twice over the duration of the road cut permit life, which is 2 years.
And please reassure me that that will kick in, that there's a follow-up process if the resident or the business does not call to say, I'm finished with my installation, please come inspect, that there is a timeline at some point that the city will act.
Yes, Chair, we've now moved away from a reactive permit inspection to a proactive. So there are 2 proactive inspections undertaken for each permit over the 2 years.
Thank you very much. My other question is for the Auditor General. On page 6 of the report, 194 reports closed this year, 27 were substantiated, and 54 were insufficient information. On that latter item, why was it only are we not able to connect with the caller or the reporter to get the more information, to draw out more information, to find out if there is a substantive issue to be addressed by the Fraud and Waste Hotline?
Mr. Chair, as we indicated, about half of the reporters come back and look at the report to see at the system to see if there's any communication from us. But there are some people that after they submit the report, in spite of the fact that we ask for more information, we never hear from them. And there are instances where people have no more information, and we've had instances where people say, you've got enough, I don't want to give you any more information. Maybe it's a fear of allowing somebody to disclose who they are, but if there isn't enough information, we're just not going to send it to management to.
And I understand that, and I'm just trying to find a way from an efficiency point of view, from a governance point of view, from a big organization like the city, to get as much information that we can, so that you could do your important work, so that we can improve.
And at the input stage, whether the person has called the telephone center or whether they're doing it via the web, there's a whole series of questions that they're taken through that they can respond to. And if they don't put any information in about, for example, what was the vehicle, what street was it on, do you have a license number, do you have a vehicle number? If they don't tell us what part of the city they saw somebody doing something in a city vehicle, then it's, in spite of the fact that they're asked to provide addresses and all these other things, some people, whether it's because they're doing it quickly or whether it's because they don't have that information in so many, about 25% of the cases, we just don't know why they are not providing us all of the information.
And I understand that. Hopefully in the revamped communications that the Fraud and Waste Hotline will enter upon, that can encourage people to make sure that they leave the proper information, that they're informed as to, as much as possible, the responsibilities of the city and what the Fraud and Waste Hotline can and cannot do, so that your resources are utilized as efficiently as possible, and so that we produce the right corrective action on that. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Auditor General, and again, all the members of your office for their wonderful work. The recommendation is that the Audit Committee recommend that council receive the report on the fraud and waste hotline. Is that carried? Thank you. There are no in-camera items. Any notices of motion? Inquiries? Other business? No. Motion to adjourn? Next meeting is undetermined. Everyone have a nice summer. Bon été.